Welcome to the deep dive. Today we've got a really interesting document in front of us titled Understanding Forces in Vedic Physics.
Yeah, and our goal here, our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack this material. We'll be looking at how modern physics, the familial stuff, and this other system the source calls Vedic Science, how they both view the fundamental forces.
The ones that basically run the universe. So expect a bit of a contrast, comparing concepts we think we know with, well, a potentially quite different perspective. Could be some surprises here about what holds everything together.
Okay, let's dive in. The absolute core concept we're tackling today is force.
Right. And the source kicks off with a definition from Maharishi Yaska in the Nirukta, defining force, or bala, as, let me get this right, the property that holds and nurtures any material.
Which straight away feels broader than just, a simple push or pull, doesn't it?
Definitely.
It's presented as something absolutely fundamental, like essential for existence itself, from the tiniest particles right up to, well, galaxies.
Yeah, the source is pretty clear on that. It says if the bonds between these subtle components, it calls them, if those cease, things just disintegrate. So existence depends on this bala.
Okay, so to kind of set the stage, let's quickly recap the modern physics view. Familiar territory. Our source reminds us modern science identifies 4 fundamental forces.
Yep, the big 4. Electromagnetic, gravitational, strong nuclear, and weak nuclear. Learned those in school.
And we associate mediator particles with them, right? Photons for EM, gravitons, well, hypothesized gravitons for gravity, gluons for the strong force, and the W and Z bosons for the weak force.
But here's a point the source makes, and it's a fair one from the modern side, too.
Right.
While we know these forces exist and have found the mediators, or most of them...
We're still working on the how.
Exactly. How do those mediators actually form? What are the rules governing their exchange? Modern physics is still, digging into that. That's a known frontier.
Right. So let's quickly sketch out their roles according to the source document. Electromagnetic, that's the force between charged particles. Attraction, repulsion, the source calls it pervasive, vital for cosmic structure, light, chemistry, basically everything.
Says the cosmos would be unstable or wouldn't exist without it?
Pretty fundamental, yeah. Then gravity acts between anything with mass, holds planets, stars, galaxies together, essential for life as we know it. And interestingly, the source mentions this is called the Ashwina force in Vedic science. We'll circle back to that.
Ashwina force, got it.
And the last 2, the nuclear forces. Strong and weak, they operate inside the atom's nucleus.
Strong force binds protons and neutrons, overcoming that powerful electric repulsion between protons.
And the weak force is involved in radioactive decay, changing one type of particle into another, both crucial for holding nuclei together and for processes like nuclear fusion, energy production.
Okay, so that's the modern picture as presented. 4 forces, known mediators mostly, but the underlying mechanics. Still some open questions.
Now, let's pivot. Let's look at the perspective from Vedic science, as described in our source. It offers a very different picture. More comprehensive, it claims.
Instead of 4 forces.
It talks about 9 distinct types of forces. And the claim is this system explains how the cosmos works at all levels, from the truly subtle, tiny stuff right up to the big picture.
And the source says these forces don't just, emerge from interactions we see now. They supposedly originate right at the beginning of the cosmos and control things from there.
That's the idea presented, yes.
Yeah.
They're fundamental controllers of subtle particles from the get-go. So let's try to unpack these 9. The terminology is specific, derived from Sanskrit, it seems. Think of them as different flavors or functions of that underlying bala. First up is the Antaryāmaḥ force.
Antaryāmaḥ. Okay, what's its job?
It's described as working through subtle energy streams. They're called rashmis. These rashmis are transmitted within and between particles and waves constantly. And its main role, to activate particles and, importantly, help them keep their state, maintain stability. So you could kind of think of it as a force for particle integrity for stability.
Stability, okay. Makes sense to have something like that. What's number 2?
That's the Antaryāmaḥ force. This one's linked directly to the cause of creation itself, activity and the intensity of energy and motion, and it specifically operates between charged particles.
Charged particles. That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Isn't that where modern physics puts EM in the nuclear forces?
Exactly. And here's where the source makes a really significant claim. It states that this one force, Antaryāmaḥ, actually encompasses 3 of the modern fundamental forces.
Wait, 3 of the 4. Which ones?
Electromagnetic, strong nuclear, and weak nuclear, all grouped under this Antaryāmaḥ concept. It's presented as the underlying driver for all those dynamic interactions that build structures at the particle level.
Wow. Okay, that is a major difference. Instead of three separate forces doing that work, it's one overarching principle, Antaryāmaḥ. That really changes the picture.
It certainly does. Moving on, number 3 is the Maitrāvaruṇaḥ force. The source calls this one crucial for cosmic existence. It apparently comes from subtle rashmis of something called Mana and Maitrāvaruṇaḥ.
Okay, more specific terms there. Mana and Maitrāvaruṇaḥ, fundamental concepts, maybe.
Seems so, yes. We'll likely touch on them more later. But this Maitrāvaruṇaḥ force, originating from them, creates other rashmis called Vajna rashmis.
And these Vajna rashmis, what do they do?
They bind together specific pairs of Prati manifestations. The source mentions Pratyapa and Pratyudana pairs. Now, Prati is key here. The source basically says the force between any two things is, at its root, the force of Prāṇa.
So Prāṇa is like the fundamental force stuff, and the Vedic uses these Vajna rashmis to link different aspects of it.
That's the idea. It's creating these fundamental energy connections. The source says it's essential for the cosmos to operate continuously from the very beginning right through to dissolution. It's always there, subtly present even within other forces.
Okay, a deep cosmic binder connecting energy flows. Got it. What about the Ajna force? You mentioned that name earlier with gravity.
Yes, good catch. The source uses Ajna for two connected but different functions. First, it acts as a subtle repulsive force, but only at extremely close range between tiny particles. It stops them from, completely merging or touching.
A tiny bumper force.
Sort of, yeah. But second, and here's the link to modern physics, it's also identified with the gravitational force, the big, extensive attractive force between masses that we know well.
Hold on, so the same force, Ajna, is responsible for pushing tiny things apart and pulling big things together. That seems counterintuitive.
It does at first glance, right. But the source presents it as a duality. Cosmic stability, it claims, comes from the balance between these two aspects, the close-up repulsion and the long-range attraction, which is gravity. The name Ajna apparently means pervasive or extensive.
So it kind of defines the space between things at the micro level while governing attraction at the macro level. Interesting balance. Okay, what's next? You said the next 3 are sort of grouped.
Yeah, they seem related to penetration, transformation, maybe purification. Let's look at Shukra, Manthi, and Agraya forces.
Shukra force. Tell me about that one.
Shukra's is described as having high penetration power. It can get deep into things. The source gives the sun's core as an example, saying it contributes to fusion there. Its main function is described as disintegrating materials, but specifically for the purpose of purifying them.
Purifying.
Yeah.
It's not a term physics usually associates with a fundamental force. It sounds more like alchemy or something.
It definitely highlights the different conceptual framework, doesn't it? Now, the Manthi force is said to be generated before Shukra acts. Manthi also penetrates deeply, but its job is to sort of stir things up at the subtle level, prepare the material for the purification or disintegration that Shukra will perform.
So Manthi is the prep cook, stirring the subtle pot, and Shukra comes in to purify or break it down.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. Stirring and then purifying at these subtle levels. And the third in this group is Grayo.
Agraya. What's its role?
This one is described as the most extensive force in the cosmos. Its key role is in the process of absorbing and emitting energy. Think of electrons jumping energy levels, absorbing or emitting photons. That's the domain of Agraya.
Oh, okay. So it's about energy exchange, like in atoms and electromagnetic interactions.
Precisely. The source says it's essential for all those atomic processes and EM interactions. It seems to work alongside that Antaryāmaḥ force we talked about earlier, but Agraya focuses specifically on the energy exchange part, the absorption and emission dance.
Right, so Antaryāmaḥ is the interaction force, the structure builder, and Agraya handles the energy transactions within that structure. Okay, that makes their relationship clear.
Good way to put it. Now, finally, the last two forces operate at what the source describes as the most fundamental level, Ukthya and Dhruva.
Ukthya force. Sounds very subtle.
It is. Its job is to give a compact form, a structure, to something called Chanda Rashmi. And get this, Chanda Rashmi are described as being themselves a form of force.
So, it's a force that shapes other force. Force stuff, maybe?
Kind of. If Chanda Rashmi is the basic force stuff, Ukthya is the principle that organizes it, gives it shape and coherence at that very fundamental level.
That's pretty abstract. Okay, and Dhruva, what does it do?
Dhruva force involves its own Rashmis that bind nearby force Rashnis together. It stops them from just scattering. It apparently works very slowly and in a very limited area, providing stability and coherence specifically to the structures of force themselves.
Okay, let me see if I follow. Uxia gives the force stuff form, and Dhruva acts like a slow local glue, holding those forms together, keeping them stable.
That's essentially the picture presented, yes. According to the source, Ukthiya and Dhruva working together ensure these basic energy patterns or force structures hold their shape. This allows particles to exist stably and lets all the other forces we discussed operate consistently.
Right. Okay, that's 9. Let's recap quickly. Antaryāmaḥ for stability. Antaryāmaḥ for creation activity, covering EM strong weak. Maitrāvaruṇaḥ, the cosmic binder via Prāṇa links. Ashvina, doing that dual micro-repulsion and macrogravity attraction thing.
Then Sukra for penetration and purification, Manthi stirring things up beforehand, and Agraya handling energy absorption emission.
And finally, the really fundamental ones. Ukthiya, structuring the force stuff, and Dhruva binding it together. It's quite a system, layers upon layers.
And the source emphasizes these 9 aren't just separate items on a list. They're presented as integral to everything that happens in the cosmos. Particle formation, energy transfer, structure, stability, motion control, combination, separation. It's all governed by these forces, according to this view.
They supposedly allow for stopping particles, starting motion, stopping motion, the whole dynamic.
And remember that thread weaving through it all. But the source is very explicit. The force between any two things is fundamentally the force of Prāṇa.
So the 9 forces aren't really distinct entities, but more like different expressions or configurations of Prāṇa.
That's exactly it. The source explains the differences we see why gravity feels different from electromagnetism. For instance, comes down to variations in the types of Prāṇa involved, how they're configured, how they align with each other.
And this links back to those Rashmis again, the subtle energy streams.
Precisely. Specific combinations of Rashmis generate specific forces. The source even gives detailed examples, though the terms are quite technical, like the force between Dhananjaya and Stratmavayu Rashmis coming from a mix of Gayatri Chanda and Prat Rashmi.
Or the force between quanta and electrons involving Stratmavayu, covering Tritup Chanda Rashmis, plus Bhokti and Bohat plus Chanda Rashmis, very specific recipes.
Yeah, and another example, the force linking Prat with Apak or Udana comes from synthesizing Mana and Stratmavayu, or using other specific Devi or divine Chanda Rashmis. It suggests a highly complex, almost combinatorial system where forces arise from these fundamental energy interactions.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Modern physics, as we know, dreams of a theory of everything, right? Finding a single unified force that underlies the 4 we currently observe.
The grand unified theory, or even further, a theory of everything.
Yes.
And this is where the source makes another bold claim. It says, Vaidic Science has already identified the true unified force.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What is it, according to the source?
It's described as the force of active Manas Tattva.
Active Manas Tattva. Okay, another key term. Where does that come from? How does it relate to Prāṇa and Rashmis?
Well, according to the source, everything, all energy, all matter ultimately arises from Prāṇa and Chanda Rashmis. And those, in turn, originate from Manas Tattva. Think of Manas Tattva as kind of fundamental potential or principle.
Like a base substance?
Sort of. But it needs to become active. And that happens, the source says, when Manas Tattva combines with another fundamental principle called Vak Tattva. This combination creates active Manas Tattva.
Mana plus Vak equals active Manas. And this active Manas Tattva is the ultimate building block.
It's presented as the material cause of all particles, yes. And the source adds that during Pralaya, cosmic dissolution, everything dissolves back into this active Manas Tattva, and then ultimately into an even more fundamental state called Prakriti.
So it's the source material and the ultimate destination, the alpha and omega of substance.
That's the framework laid out. And crucially, the force associated with this active Manas Tattva is what the source identifies as the true unified force modern science is searching for.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
There is. The source describes this force of active Manas Tattva as the most subtle force of all. So subtle that it cannot be detected by any physical instruments or techniques we currently possess.
So the ultimate unified force in this view is fundamentally beyond our current scientific grasp. That's a significant statement.
It really is, and it raises the question, if active Manas Tattva is the single source, why is the universe so diverse? Why so many different things?
Good question. Does the source address that?
It does. It explains that while Mana Tattva itself is spread out evenly, homogeneously, Vak Tattva, the other component, has varying density throughout the cosmos.
Ah, so the ratio of mana to Vak isn't constant everywhere.
Exactly. The density of Vak Tattva changes. And because active Manas Tattva is the combination of the two, this variation in the mix leads to all the different forms, forces, and actions we see. Without that variability in Vak, the source argues, you couldn't get the complexity and diversity of the cosmos.
That adds a dynamic element to the unified source.
Okay.
But the source doesn't stop there, does it? It goes even deeper.
It takes one final and perhaps the most profound step, especially from a philosophical angle. It states that behind even this fundamental force of active Manas Tattva, there works the force of a supreme conscious entity.
Consciousness as the ultimate source of physical force.
That is precisely the claim. This supreme conscious entity is said to continuously vibrate Manas Tattva, which causes Vak Tattva to be produced.
So consciousness generates Vak.
Yes, and then this Vak combines with the ever-present Mana Tattva to create the active Manas Tattva, the immediate source of all particles and forces. So consciousness is positioned as the prime mover, the ultimate origin.
How does it supposedly do this? Is there a mechanism described?
The source brings in another tattva, Kala Tattva, which translates to time. It says the supreme conscious entity uses Kala Tattva, time, as the instrument to produce the inherent forces within Manas Tattva and Vak Tattva. This establishes what the source presents as the absolute root causal chain for force creation in the universe. Consciousness using time, acting on fundamental principles, mana, Vak, to generate the unified force, active Manas Tattva, which then manifests as everything else.
Wow. Okay, so starting from the four forces of modern physics, searching for unification, we've explored this Vedic perspective, which proposes 9 forces, links them all fundamentally to Prāṇa, unifies that under active Manas Tattva.
Which itself arises from the interplay of mana and Vak Tattva.
An interplay ultimately driven by a supreme conscious entity operating through time. It's a completely different way of looking at the universe's foundations.
It certainly shifts the definition of force way beyond just physical pushes and pulls. It incorporates subtle energies, fundamental principles, consciousness, and time right into the core definition.
So wrapping this up, what's the main takeaway from digging into this source? We've clearly seen a contrast. Modern physics, with its 4 forces, identified mediators, but ongoing questions about the deep how. And this Vedic view with 9 forces, detailed origins in Rashmi combinations and Prāṇa, and a path to unification via Manas Tattva.
And that Vedic unification points to something active. Manas Tattva claimed to be the true unified force, but simultaneously described as being inaccessible to our current physical detection methods.
And ultimately tracing the origin back even further to consciousness acting through time. It's a radically different ontology, really.
It definitely invites us to consider possibilities beyond purely physical explanations for the universe's fundamental workings.
Which leads to a pretty big question to leave folks with, doesn't it? If the ultimate source of all force, as this source suggests, is something as subtle as active Manas Tattva, driven by consciousness and time, and fundamentally beyond our physical measurement.
What does that imply?
Yeah, what does that imply about the inherent limitations of our current scientific approach? Can our instruments ever grasp the deepest reality if it operates on a non-physical level, according to this perspective? It makes you wonder about the nature of reality itself and the tools we use to explore it.
Definitely something to chew on. A question that sits at the boundary of physics and philosophy.
Indeed, something to ponder until our next deep dive.